Hello, I'm William from Jiu-Jitsu Health, where we support fitness, martial arts, and wellness for all ages and families. Today, we're thrilled to have Chris Van Nostrand, founder and head coach at StrengthWise Barbell in Evanston, Illinois. He is a strength and conditioning specialist, nutrition coach, and accomplished powerlifter with extensive professional affiliations and over 100 clients. So thank you and welcome, Chris, for joining us. Please tell us a little bit about your background.
So I am a strength and conditioning coach, as you mentioned, with a specialty in masters athletes. So those over 40 who want to remain competitive in their sports for decades to come. And I arrived at that niche after competing for many years on my own as a competitive power lifter, while actually working in a totally different career. So I was in a traditional kind of a corporate job while I was lifting on the side as an amateur athlete. And over time, realized that the system that I had put together for myself that would allow me to train and work and raise a family and be a good husband and all that, that the system that I put together could be really helpful to other people. And I was looking for a career change anyway, thinking about doing something different because it was the height of the pandemic. I just began to self-reflect a little bit more on what it would be like to take my approach and turn it into a coaching program. And so that occurred about 4 years ago. So prior to that, as mentioned, I was working in a more traditional setting. I was actually in higher education, marketing and admissions, and then followed that career path from my days right out of undergraduate. So went to college, got into higher ed administration, got my MBA from the Kellogg School, and so continued down again this sort of marketing route and really enjoyed it. But just at this point where again I began to reflect on what I would like to do differently with my life, and coaching had always been there in the background, and I'd always had this passion for barbell lifting, and again had discovered a competitive outlet in powerlifting, and thought this is something that could really be useful to other folks who are over 40 who really want to continue to stay in the game.
That's great. Yeah. So thinking about that, how do you approach training athletes in different sports? As you know, I'm coming from a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu background, and that's kind of our the core audience. But there's also people, in other sports. There's a lot of wrestlers, and there's some judo people, and just a lot of Muay Thai. So, what's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think there's two kind of intersecting factors. One is the sport, and then one is the individual athlete. And so my coaching philosophy is to think about those two things together, or kind of in an integrated fashion. So on the sport level, I tend to build from the basic blocks, which for me again is really barbell training. Which is not to say that every one of my athletes is constantly lifting heavy barbells, but I tend to approach things kind of with the attitude that I can do the most with the limited training time that we have if we're really focused on making sure that someone can squat, can bench press, can deadlift, and can overhead press. So if we
Yep.
can begin with kind of these functional building blocks, that tends to cover a lot of ground.
Gotcha.
And then the other piece from there is assume that just about every sport is going to benefit from increased strength. The next consideration is just specifically the energy systems that are important to each individual sport. So is the sport going to rely more primarily on aerobic and endurance capabilities? Are we talking about a runner or a triathlete, or is it in fact someone like someone who's doing BJJ or a mixed martial artist who may need higher lactic energy system capacity. And of course, then being able to bring those energy systems together in a complete way. So knowing that for your average mixed martial artist, they are going to need the ability to complete these very high, intense, short bouts of activity, but they're also going to need an aerobic system to recover. So those are kind of the overall two approaches: is make sure that the strength foundation is there, and then think specifically about the energy system demands for each sport. But then, of course, again, that intersects with the individual athlete. So, someone who's more or less experienced at lifting, that may dictate what we do on the strength training side. So, for example, if someone has spent the last couple of years really building up their core barbell foundation, we may actually want to back off a little bit from that and complement their strength training some slightly more explosive work, maybe specifically with Olympic lifts. Maybe we actually want to work at more on a unilateral basis if they've been doing exclusively bilateral lifts. And same thing from an energy system perspective. If someone has really built that aerobic foundation, say in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but they have trouble, say, closing distances, or if they're gassing out, early on in a striking exchange, that might be, that may mean that we need to spend a little bit more time on kind of that high end conditioning, uh, approaching closer to that kind of lactic threshold. So there's different considerations for each person, but that's how I ultimately lay it out.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, just on a personal note, it took me about a year for my body to adjust to BJJ. I went through a lot of injuries, and it took it took a little while for my body to get ready for 3 to 5 days a week or whatever it is that I'd be training. One of the things I think is interesting that's going on at the school that I'm at as well is, there's a lot of parents that are getting their kids into not only BJJ, but they also have school wrestling programs too. And so there's a lot of times where parents are, you know, curious about how to get their kid in to BJJ or wrestling, what it is that they should be instructing their kids to look out for, to do. Um, so, what's your overall, kind of high level thought of when a parent's considering getting into BJJ or wrestling? What are some of the high level thoughts of recommendations for them, for the kids and for them?
That's a good question. I've done a decent amount of youth training, and I think we should begin with the assumption that it's something that the kid is really interested in. In my experience, it's really challenging for a parent to make the decision for a kid about what sport they're going to be involved in. That'll you kind of hit a wall relatively quickly with that in terms of the kid's interest. And therefore their ability to improve. So, first and foremost, if we just begin with the assumption that the kid is really driving this conversation about their interest in sport, I think what's really important at the youth level is focusing on movement quality, and that's important in coaching overall. That's important in strength and conditioning training overall. But it's particularly important for those who are 18 and under, that when it comes to, say, learning the fundamentals of the squat, or understanding how to warm up correctly, or understanding breathing techniques, that we're really focused on making sure the kid understands how to move their body well in those movements. And that tends to then translate over to sport, because if they understand in a training context what they're supposed to be doing and what it means to be aware of, say, how they're squatting in space, or how, the muscles that they're trying to activate, which muscles are there are those on the bench press. If they become more body aware, and they're focused more on movement quality, that tends to translate really well to just about any sport. So I think that's the first place to begin: is, are we really teaching movement quality? And that's also because if we focus on movement quality, that's going to set a kid up just for long-term success and fitness throughout life, right? If whether when they get older, when they're an adult, if they pursue another sport, that level of focus on movement quality and understanding how their body works is going to be really relevant.
What about nutrition? What should the parents be feeding the young athletes? We all know sometimes getting them to eat the right things is obviously difficult, especially depending on the age group. Typically, I think I could be wrong, but for BJJ, the age usually on average sort of starts around 10 or so. Now, we all know that some people start much earlier, but I think, uh, 10 to 18 is kind of like a popular um, age group, I guess you could say, for that, and wrestling as well.
I would actually give a somewhat similar answer depending on the age of the athlete as the answer about training, which is focus on food quality above all else. So make sure that, first of all, the kid really is thinking about nutrition from the perspective of healthy foods that they enjoy eating. So for an 8 or 10-year old, forcing them to to down a whole bunch of broccoli and steak is not necessarily going to be the right approach. I think the focus needs to be more on what kind of foods does that kid enjoy that also make them feel good. And so it's similar to the movement idea where can they start to draw a connection between eating more whole foods and then how that makes them feel when they're actually on the mat.
Nice.
As that athlete gets a little bit older, in general, for all my athletes, my focus is really on developing lean body mass. So eating from the perspective of how can really maximize building muscle and other healthy lean tissue while you're in this relatively early stage of life. Because as we know, as we get older, it's really hard to build muscle. So it's I think it's really important to focus less on kind of what's happening on the caloric side, so long as the kid is eating healthily, and really focus on this is the time of life, like all the way through the teenage years, starting at about the age of 15 or 16, depending again on the gender. This is really the age to be focused on how can we build some healthy mass.
Yeah. Now, I'm of course focused a little heavy on the BJJ side of things, but a lot of what you're saying crosses over to the regular person who's just simply working out all the way to different sports. So, from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specifically, how would you, how should someone approach their strength and conditioning routine for that sort of a sport?
Absolutely. So for that sort of a sport, I would really make sure that there's a good periodization plan in place, which just means over the course of a year, what are the different training cycles that you're moving through, and making sure that there's a portion of the year that's furthest away from any potential competitions where you're really building your foundation and you have more of what we call development blocks, where the focus is on developing a wide range of physical capabilities, including strength and power and explosiveness, putting on some lean body mass. And then you potentially, as you get closer to a competition season or to about, transitioning from some of those more general development blocks into slightly more specific training, where you may start to mimic in the strength training phase some movements that you may actually encounter on the mat. So, kind of at a high level, again, the idea is let's employ a periodization scheme where, depending on where you are in your season or where you are just in your overall training, that you're going through some training blocks and some training cycles with some intentionality and some strategy.
Yeah. So this might be kind of a hard question, but I'm thinking more along the lines of, are there any common mistakes you see beginners making in their training? Now that's, such a crazy open-ended question, but um, I mean, that could range from techniques to all kinds of things. So, and like you said before, it depends on their motivation. I mean, there's a million things involved with this, but I'm just curious if there's sort of some common denominators that you've seen.
Absolutely. I would say the most common mistake for a beginner to make is to progress too slowly, actually. And that may seem a little counterintuitive, particularly if you're even talking about someone who's a little bit competitive in their sport. But often I see people that start with really high rep work and low weights, and they tend to kind of stay in that comfort zone for a while. And early on, assuming you're a novice to strength training, or you're just thinking about trying to get stronger for your sport, it is important to bring a certain amount of intensity to that lifting, to focus on some heavier lifting. It doesn't have to be your routine doesn't have to be all reps of 5 all the time at 95% of your one rep max. But for most beginners, I see that they're just not pushing themselves hard enough at the beginning. And again, we want to make sure technique, like you mentioned, is good. But I think sometimes people focus a little bit too much on perfect technique and high rep work, thinking that that will give them, sort of the best payoff or take the least amount of energy. And so that will detract least from their sport. But I think they end up not getting as much out of those early training periods as they could.
Yeah, nutrition clearly plays a huge role in this performance as well. In thinking about BJJ for adults, and wrestling, I would think as well could be Muay Thai. But what are your top nutrition tips for someone you could say starting in BJJ because really for I forget who it is, but there was some phrase of only 10% of the people who start actually make it to blue belt, and then only 1% make it to black. And I think that first year or 2 year is a pretty steep curve for a lot of people. And nutrition is clearly it could be one of the main components that might be holding them back in some way because BJJs, just like wrestling or many other sports, it's a real combination of anaerobic and aerobic.
Well, absolutely. My answer on nutrition actually ties back to my answer on the strength training side, which is in addition to, or because you're going to be pushing some heavy weights, in addition to learning the technique of this new sport, if you assume someone's, in the early phases of BJJ, you're going to need to actually eat a decent amount. So I think making sure that you're properly fueled is job number one. It's really easy to end up just not eating enough in the context of pursuing this new sport or adding strength training in, say, if you already are a seasoned competitor. So making sure that you're eating enough, and really specifically that each meal you have a balance of protein, complex carbohydrates, some simple carbohydrates, and fat as well. So I think, from my perspective, I like to keep it easy and keep it simple. And rather than micromanaging nutrition, I really just like to make sure at the outset that everyone is getting relatively balanced meals. Once that is layered in, so for instance, once they have a pretty good idea of how to put together a meal, with a lean protein, with a complex carbohydrate, with a fat, and with a little bit of a simple carbohydrate. So, for example, if they have figured out, a recipe that works for them, where they're having, chicken breast with broccoli, a little bit of white rice, and an avocado on top. Like if that's a meal that works for them, and they can come up with different versions of that, once that happens, then we can usually start to talk about some specific pre and post workout and potentially intra workout nutrition strategies too. But that's really the place to start, is making sure that your diet fundamentally is in a good place, and that fundamentally you have some good nutrition patterns.
So one thing I was thinking about is how BJJ people can balance training with strength conditioning workouts without overtraining. One of the things that I've personally encountered is if if I'm training 4 days a week, and depending on how hard the day or the session was, usually it's about an hour and a half every day, or each session. And sometimes I really just need a full day off before I can get back. And in that day off, there are some times where I think, there's no way I can lift today because, so for some, especially as people get older, maybe not so much the kids, you could rest for 30 minutes and they could wrestle for another 2 hours, right?
Exactly.
But especially as you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, and further out, any suggestions on kind of balancing that out?
That's a great question. That is the core of what I do. Um, I think that, as I mentioned, it's important to have a certain amount of heavy lifting early on, so that you're building that strength foundation. I think it's important to note that does not necessarily mean a lot of volume, or hours of lifting weights and hours of being in the gym in addition to your BJJ training or any martial arts training. So we might be talking about, say, 2 days a week where you're performing 3 to 5 sets of a few key movements. So we can, so long as the intensity is high enough, we can really dial back on volume in most cases, so that you're not grinding through training in some form 7 days a week. Right. I think that's the first part. The other is really making sure that your recovery is strategic, and that you actually have kind of a performance recovery mindset, which is, there may be days where you do, in fact, want to sit around and do absolutely nothing, and relaxation is going to be the best way to recover. And you may discover through a little bit of experimentation that, say, if you are doing your jiu-jitsu training 4 days a week, And then you have two strength training sessions built into one of those 4 days. You might have then two official off days. And it may be that on one of those off days, you actually do a little bit of intentional recovery, something like some additional aerobic work, even if it's just 20 minutes on the bicycle at zone 2, zone 2 heart rate. Maybe it's a couple sets of some upper body work as well if your lower body is particularly fatigued. So those are kind of the elements to keep in mind, which is you can really manage at a high level how much volume you're doing to make sure that recovery is there. But then you can also really put together a recovery program that balances out some of that real true downtime that you do still need.
Nice. Mental preparation is also crucial. How do you help some of your athletes develop mental toughness?
It's a great question. I think as I've gotten older, I've certainly seen in myself how important the mental side of things is. The way that I approach this with all my athletes, but particularly those again who are in their 40s, 50s, where we have a lot of responsibilities on our plates, like mortgages and paying the bills and raising kids, is that you only have one gas tank. So you do have to keep in mind that the week that you are facing a huge amount of financial stress, or maybe you have a parent that's sick or a kid that's sick, that may not be the week to try to really, really go for it in the gym. So that's the first thing is mentally you have to be willing to pull back a little bit because you only have one stress tank, right? You only have one gas tank that the stress can fill up. And your central nervous system doesn't so much care whether it's more mental stress or more physical stress, right? It all is kind of processed in the same way. So that's one big part is just being aware of that reality. The other part is not creating unnecessary and unproductive stress on the basis of how any one individual training session goes. So that's where the mindfulness piece really comes in. You're showing up to the gym, you are doing the best you can in that moment, you're focused on movement quality, and maybe, for a week or two, if there is a lot of other stuff going on in your life, the sessions aren't going to feel great. Maybe they'll feel like a slog, but it's important not to get overly obsessed with that reality that the sessions may not be going great. Because again, that's just going to be producing more stress, which you're already overfilled with. So I think just kind of taking the sessions day by day. Some sessions are going to feel great, some won't. And not worrying about that because that ultimately serves no good. I think that's a really important lesson for folks to remember as they continue to compete for decades to come.
Right. So one thing I was thinking about is flexibility and mobility. And everyone, we all know that everyone has their own natural abilities, I think, and in terms of flexibility. And, what are your suggestions for people who just somehow naturally are not very flexible? They have extremely tight shoulders or hips. And especially as people get older, that becomes even more of a problem, say, after 50 in particular. On the other side of the spectrum, I've personally rolled with some people, some kids who are 18, 19, who are unbelievably flexible naturally. And, I think maybe there's even a point where, should those people even bother stretching out that much because they have so much flexibility to begin with? I don't know. So there's a real range, and I'm just kind of curious. You have some testing, maybe routines that you go through for people in the beginning, and how do you manage the flexibility with what it is that they're training for?
Well, you're absolutely right that there's a continuum, and that's true for most things in fitness. And so there is a continuum with mobility, specifically, we'll talk about first, from being immobile or relatively less mobile to hypermobile. And so for most folks, finding some way to be in between those two extremes is the best option. So usually the way that I assess that is in the context of functional movements that are really important. So I want to see how well somebody can squat or how well somebody can hip hinge while they're under a little bit of load. So my assessment usually involves, even if it's a light amount of weight, seeing how well somebody can move their body while trying to operate under some kind of load. From there, this is where the individualization piece really comes in, because while I'm a big fan of barbells, it's totally conceivable that for, say, someone who has a history of shoulder issues, who's over 50, that overhead barbell presses are not going to work for them, because their training time, and particularly their strength training, may need to incorporate mobility within it. And so it may very well be that other tools like kettlebells and dumbbells of a single arm version may do a better job of providing both strength, but also allowing us to build strength in different ranges, and develop some functional mobility as well that we might not just get with a heavy overhead barbell press. So um, there's the individualization based on the individual, and then absolutely the individualization based on the sport. And so for jiu-jitsu, definitely those positions are going to require way more mobility than somebody that I'm working with who's competing in powerlifting. And so that then becomes just a matter of programming for them effectively over the course of the week.
That's one of the reasons why I really appreciate the science and the foundation and the knowledge, for of coaches like yourself and what you do, because for an athlete, no matter what sport they're in, they only have so much time during the week to do whatever it is that they have to do. And it's not easy to develop an effective and efficient program without somebody like you helping them out, because there's a million different types of exercises to do, and you
Absolutely
could
right.
easily get bogged down into doing the wrong thing for too long or too less time or whatever. So yeah, I think what you're saying really helps out.
Well, you hit the nail on the head, which is efficiency. Again, for most of my population, but even for youth trainees who are in school, no one has 3 hours a day to devote to strength and conditioning training. Really, just in just about any situation, unless they're a professional. So we do have to be pretty mindful of how much time is actually available, and I'm a big fan of creative constraints. And so many times we'll start with how much time do you actually have, and let's use that to then build backwards into the most effective program for you. And that, it's amazing what you can do if you find out that someone might only have 35 minutes to train. It can force you to be super creative, and super efficient with putting together a program that still gets someone really, really good results, and maybe equally good results as if they had an hour.
Right. Yeah. Um, so how do you stay updated on the latest research and trends with strength and conditioning? Because especially now with everything computer, there's so much information coming in, and not only that, but the problem is not all of it is correct.
Definitely. That is a great question. So the way that I approach it is twofold. One is I set time aside each week to focus on research. So that's a trick that I learned from my corporate days, right? Where you're only going to get stuff done if you actually allocate time to it. And so if it's a priority, you got to find a way. So for me, it's carving out one day a week that I really do a deep dive into the literature. Um, and then the second thing is I try to really research specific relevant questions that I'm faced with, because there is so much information out there. If I decide that one day, I want to learn, what has the last decade taught us about, strength and conditioning as it applies to sport X, I'm probably not going to be able to get through that, right, in any decent amount of time. So I prefer to begin with what are the most common challenges that my clients are facing, and what is the what are the last few studies really shine a light on in regards to that. So it might be, for instance, um, what is the latest research saying about effective volume? So really, how much does somebody need to be training per week in various stages? in order to get the maximum amount of strength or muscle gain with the least amount of fatigue. So that's a very specific question that I can tend to read up on in a relatively quick amount of time. And then I think that is just with experience and time, you start to develop a little bit of a sense for where a study is an outlier, and presents something that's kind of new and interesting that's worth thinking about, and where is there information that just doesn't really match up with the current body of evidence. So maybe to treat that with a little less, or be a little bit more skeptical with that. But I think that second part, how can you kind of weed through good information from bad? A lot of that just comes down to time and experience.
Could you recommend just one resource or book for the listeners?
Absolutely. I think if someone is really interested in evidence-based training, a great resource is Stronger by Science. They put out an excellent research publication called Mass, which actually summarizes some key topics as well in the literature, and they will often take a deep dive into methodology and popular topics and what's been happening over the last 5 or 10 years. So for the layperson who just kind of wants to get a sense of what's out there and kind of a high level understanding of some big topics, Stronger by Science is really, really a resource that I enjoy. Um, I think for those who are really interested more specifically, maybe in the bodybuilding side, so it's not as relevant to jiu-jitsu or to the strength and conditioning side. But if folks like to follow personalities on YouTube, Jeff Nippert is a really good person for understanding a little bit about the science behind strength building. There are also some excellent researchers out there who are also making their information more digestible on social media. And so the big one there is Brad Schoenfeld. He's also put out a couple of books, but he's kind of the foremost researcher right now on hypertrophy or building muscle. And a lot of what he is uncovering is helpful, even if it's even if you apply it to a sports setting.
Great. Before we wrap up, what's the most rewarding part of your job as a coach?
The most rewarding part for me as a coach is, I think, overcoming myths and obstacles that have stood in people's way before about fitness. So I grew up in the, no pain, no gain era, right? It was go into the gym and thrash yourself because the more micro tears you got, the better. That meant your muscles were going to grow bigger and stronger. And that's had a really negative effect over the years because people ended up burning out if they got into exercise, or they were just daunted by the idea of adding a strength and conditioning program because their expectation, again, was that they were going to have to just absolutely push themselves to the limit. And so I think the most rewarding thing for me as a coach is explaining to people that you can make really good progress doing way less. And a lot of times, not only are we doing way less, but we're really prioritizing recovery, which means that you actually want to think about, you having an active social life. You want to think about doing things that are fun. If you enjoy going to the sauna, that can actually be part of your recovery. So I think helping people uncover maybe that slightly more enlightened approach to fitness is the thing that I enjoy the most.
Great, great. Um, how can people get a hold of you?
They can reach me at Strengthwise Barbell on both Facebook and Instagram. And I'm also at strengthwisebarbell.com on the web.